Imagine this for a moment. Greek men, draped not in togas or armor, but in Buddhist robes. And not in Greece, but in the rugged mountains of ancient Afghanistan more than 23 centuries ago. Their names, Dharmarakshita and Mahadharmarakshita, are still there, carved in stone, waiting patiently for us to notice. For over 2,000 years, those inscriptions have held a story that feels almost impossible. That centuries before Buddhism ever reached China, Japan, or Thailand, it found unlikely students in men from Greece. And what those men discovered in the stillness of those mountains is more than dusty history. It is medicine. Medicine for a restless, overwhelmed, anxious mind. The same kind of mind so many of us live with today. Because this isn't just a quirky fact about cultural exchange. This is the origin story of the very practices millions of us now turn to for relief from stress, for deeper sleep, for a quiet mind, and for a sense of peace we thought we'd lost. Think about it. Every time you press play on a meditation app, every time you pause to notice your breath, every time you whisper to yourself, let it go. You're part of a lineage that began when Greek rationality collided with Buddhist compassion in those faraway valleys. This meeting of worlds changed everything. It gave rise to a new kind of wisdom, practical, human, universal. A wisdom that does not belong to East or West, but to all of us. So today, I want to invite you into this story. Not as a lecture, not as a history lesson, but as a journey. A 3-hour journey, if you'll allow it, that will shift how you see both ancient history and your own path to peace. Take a moment now. Find the position that feels most natural. Maybe it's sinking into your favorite chair. Maybe it's lying down with a soft blanket. Maybe you're walking, earbuds in, letting the rhythm of your steps carry you. However you've arrived here, you are exactly where you need to be. Because just like those ancient wisdom seekers, we too are scattered across continents. Different places, different languages, but all listening for the same thing. The sound of peace within ourselves. There's something profoundly beautiful about that, don't you think? So breathe deeply. Let yourself settle. And as you do, remember this. The practices that soothe you today, mindfulness, meditation, breathing through difficult days, were not invented last decade or even last century. They were born in a sacred collision of cultures, a meeting that still echoes across time. And now together, let's travel back to the dusty roads where Greek travelers first heard whispers of the Buddha. Back to the monasteries where their names were carved in stone. Back to where it all began.
The Persian foundation,
so we can understand not just
in the
history,
gentle hills
but
and
ourselves.
vast sunlit plains of ancient Persia, more than 26 centuries ago, there lived a ruler whose quiet wisdom would ripple across continents and generations. His name was Cyrus. History remembers him as Cyrus the Great, but what truly made him great was not simply the size of his empire or the power of his armies, it was the rare insight with which he chose to lead. Picture his empire at its height, a vast realm stretching over 4,000 miles, from the sapphire blue waters of the Mediterranean to the rugged mountain passes of what we now call Afghanistan. Across this sweeping landscape thrived countless communities, each speaking their own language, each with unique customs, each holding sacred traditions that shape their way of understanding the divine. In most eras of human history, such diversity would have been treated as a problem, a challenge to be crushed into uniformity by force. But Cyrus saw something far deeper. To him, this variety of cultures was not a threat, it was a garden filled with many flowers, each needing its own kind of care. His leadership was not about domination, it was about tending. His greatness lay not in conquest, but in his ability to create a world where people could breathe freely as themselves. What set Cyrus apart was noticed even in his own lifetime and carefully recorded by ancient scholars. He had a gentle yet unwavering habit. He honored the customs and spiritual beliefs of every people under his protection. This was not a clever political trick, though it certainly proved wise. It was a profound understanding that lasting strength does not come from forcing others to adopt your ways. It comes from making space for all to flourish according to their own nature. The most moving example of this wisdom unfolded in Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, a city famed for its culture, its learning, and its towering walls. When Cyrus's influence reached Babylon, he found that the Jewish people had been living there in exile for generations, grandparents and grandchildren alike separated from their ancestral homeland, their sacred temple lying in ruins. Cyrus could have kept them as subjects. He could have used them to serve his empire's needs. Instead, he did something almost unimaginable for his time. He issued the Edict of Restoration, a simple, compassionate invitation for these families to return home, to rebuild their temple, and to reclaim the spiritual life that had been torn from them. Can you imagine the joy that must have spread through those families? Grandparents who had resigned themselves to die in exile, suddenly watching their grandchildren prepare for a journey they thought they would never see. The stories of Jerusalem, once whispered with longing around evening fires, now became living plans for the future. This single act of leadership left such an indelible mark that Cyrus is still remembered with gratitude in the Hebrew Bible to this day. Remarkably, he is not praised for converting to their religion or demanding loyalty to himself. He is remembered because he protected their right to be who they were. Cyrus understood something timeless. Communities thrive when they feel safe to be themselves. And when people feel safe, they trust. That trust creates a foundation of loyalty no army could ever enforce. Historical records show that Cyrus developed an extraordinarily sophisticated system of governance. Instead of imposing one rigid law from a distant throne, he established networks of local administrators who partnered with central leadership. This was not exploitation dressed as cooperation, it was genuine partnership. When people feel valued and respected, they naturally give their best to the common good. Cyrus understood this before most leaders in history ever did. Ancient inscriptions reveal how this system worked. Through careful writing, clear communication, and monumental inscriptions, Cyrus's principles of tolerance and cooperation were shared across vast distances. These were not harsh decrees. They were invitations, statements of partnership and hope. Imagine living in a small village at the edge of the empire, hearing the words of this distant king read aloud, words that promised not oppression but respect. For many, this must have felt like a miracle. The Persian influence flowed gently eastward into the mountain regions that would one day become central to the story of Buddhism's global journey. Persian administrators, merchants, and scholars reached into what we now call Afghanistan and Pakistan, linking these ancient communities into a wider network of cultures and ideas. Trade routes that once served only local needs blossomed into great highways of exchange. Along with goods, spices, textiles, and precious metals, there traveled stories, philosophies, and wisdom. This openness created fertile ground for something extraordinary. Indian communities became valued participants in the Persian world, not as conquered subjects but as partners. When military service was needed, Indian contingents fought alongside Persians, not out of fear, but because they trusted their role in a broader vision of stability and prosperity. Some Indian travelers even journeyed westward as far as Greece during the Great Persian-Greek conflicts. These travelers returned home with treasures more precious than gold: knowledge. They had seen with their own eyes the Persian methods of administration and the astonishing Greek devotion to learning and debate. They heard new languages, watched foreign rituals, and encountered unfamiliar philosophies. Back home, they shared what they learned. The Persians were affectionately called Kamboja, and the Greeks became Yona or Yavana in Indian tongues. These were no longer distant, mythical peoples. They were living cultures that Indian traders, soldiers, and scholars had touched, worked alongside, and learned from. And the knowledge did not remain confined to royal courts. It flowed through bazaars, along caravan routes, and around evening fires. Storytellers wove tales of faraway lands, merchants described Greek markets, priests discussed Persian religious tolerance. The very idea that cultures could learn from each other took root deeply in Indian soil. Think of what a revolutionary concept this was. In an age when most rulers demanded rigid conformity, Cyrus and his successors demonstrated a radical truth. Diversity is not a weakness, it is a strength. Different communities could offer unique gifts, and when those gifts were honored, something greater than any single tradition could emerge. This Persian foundation of tolerance and exchange would, generations later, prepare the world for the spread of Buddhist wisdom. When the teachings of the Buddha began to travel beyond India, they did not spread into hostile or isolated lands. They moved along trade routes already nurtured by Persian policy. They found audiences already curious about new ideas, already accustomed to the possibility that truth could come from a stranger. Even Emperor Ashoka, the great Buddhist ruler of India, would later adopt administrative practices strikingly similar to those pioneered by Cyrus. Inscriptions carved into stone, messages of moral and spiritual guidance carried across the empire. None of this was coincidence. It was the legacy of a Persian vision that valued communication, patience, and respect for all. Most importantly, Cyrus planted a seed in the human imagination. Wisdom can emerge from unexpected places. A Persian king learned from Jewish traditions. Indian travelers learned from Greek customs. Persian administrators wove lessons from all their partner peoples into a rich tapestry of governance and culture. This was a quiet revolution in human thought. That seed of openness, of learning from strangers rather than fearing them, would make possible the extraordinary meetings between Greek rationalism and Buddhist compassion that history would later witness. Without Cyrus's example, that cross-cultural flowering might never have occurred. And so, when we meditate today, when we speak of tolerance and compassion, when we marvel at global interconnectedness, we are still living in the shade of trees planted over 2,500 years ago by a Persian king who believed that true greatness lies not in power, but in respect. The Persian foundation was not just a historical accident, it was an intentional choice to lead with wisdom rather than fear, with curiosity rather than control. It remains a beacon for our own age, a reminder that the best of humanity blossoms when we make space for each other to be fully ourselves.
Alexander's arrival. For more than 2 centuries, the Persian Empire flowed across the ancient world like a great river, connecting distant peoples and cultures. It carried not just armies and rulers, but stories, ideas, and ways of life. It was a gentle current of exchange that stretched from the blue waters of the Mediterranean to the snow-capped mountain passes of Central Asia. But like all rivers, history has its seasons. Currents change. By 327 BCE, those currents were shifting toward a young king from Macedonia, a figure whose name would echo across time, Alexander. The world remembers him as Alexander the Great, a conqueror, a strategist, a king whose campaigns stretched further than anyone had dreamed. But for our journey, what makes Alexander remarkable is not the kingdoms he claimed. It is the wisdom he carried with him, often unknowingly. Picture an extraordinary sight, a young ruler, still in his 20s, marching eastward.
Behind him, not only soldiers with shields and spears, but also philosophers, historians, scientists, poets, seekers of truth. This was no ordinary army. It was a traveling school of thought. Alexander had been shaped by Aristotle, who had learned from Plato, who himself had sat at the feet of Socrates. The lineage of Greek wisdom walked with him. Alexander understood something that few conquerors ever grasp. The world's greatest treasures are not its gold or palaces, but its insights, its ideas about how human beings can live, think, and find meaning. As his army crossed into the lands that Cyrus and the Persians had once governed with such foresight, Alexander and his companions were not only searching for victory, they were curious. What wisdom might they find in these distant lands? What truths might they learn from those whose lives and beliefs were unlike their own? The philosophers traveling with Alexander had heard whispers, stories of Indian sages who spoke of peace, of suffering, of the mysterious depths of the human mind. They wondered, what conversations might happen when the Greek love for questioning met the Indian devotion to contemplation? When logic and inquiry crossed paths with meditation and compassion? The answer would surpass all expectations. When Alexander's expedition reached the mountainous regions we now call Afghanistan and Pakistan, they encountered something that astonished them. In the ancient region of Gandhara, nestled among peaks that seemed to pierce the sky, they found Greek communities, thriving, vibrant, alive. These were not new arrivals or fellow travelers who had somehow wandered ahead of the army. These were families whose grandparents and great-grandparents had been gently relocated here decades earlier by Persian kings, who, following Cyrus's wisdom, believed in integration rather than destruction. What might have once seemed exile had transformed into something beautiful. In these mountain valleys, transplanted Greeks had not merely survived, they had blossomed. They built homes with familiar Greek columns and courtyards. They continued their beloved traditions of philosophical dialogue and storytelling, yet they also embraced their new world. They learned local languages, they attended festivals with Persian neighbors and Indian merchants. Their children grew up bilingual or trilingual, able to recite Greek poetry and sing songs in regional tongues. They celebrated wisdom wherever they found it. Gandhara had become something almost unique in the ancient world, a living tapestry of cultures. Walk through its markets and you could hear Greek merchants debating philosophy with Indian traders, while Persian administrators sharing stories of Zoroastrian cosmology. In its workshops, craftsmen from multiple backgrounds share techniques, blending artistic motifs into something entirely new. Greek statues adorned with lotus flowers, Indian stupas decorated with acanthus leaves. It was proof of what becomes possible when differences are met with curiosity rather than fear. For Alexander's companions, especially his philosophers, this was a revelation. These Greeks of Gandhara were not isolated exiles clinging to old ways. They were bridge builders. They had maintained their intellectual heritage while also learning from Persian organization and Indian spirituality. They could translate ideas between worlds that had never spoken to each other. The conversations that unfolded here were unlike anything in history up to that point. Greek thinkers, trained in systematic questioning, met Indian teachers who had spent lifetimes mapping the landscapes of consciousness and compassion. These weren't hostile debates. They were genuine exchanges driven by mutual recognition. Wisdom knows wisdom, no matter its language. Among Alexander's companions was a philosopher named Pyrrho. He was especially drawn to these encounters. In the ancient city of Taxila, a renowned center of learning, Pyrrho spent months meeting Indian teachers who had developed extraordinary insights about perception, suffering, and peace. Though they may not have been Buddhist monks specifically, they belonged to the same flowering of wisdom that gave birth to Buddhism across the region. Pyrrho listened, he observed, and what he learned would quietly reshape Greek philosophy. Later in his life, Pyrrho would teach ideas that sound astonishingly similar to Buddhist insights about the nature of reality and tranquility. Ideas about how our perceptions shape our suffering and how letting go of rigid judgments opens a path to inner peace. We cannot say these influences were direct, but the echoes are undeniable. When the time came for Alexander to move on, he made a decision whose significance would echo for centuries. He did not order all Greeks to march back west with him. Instead, he invited many to stay, to put down roots in Gandhara. These were not military colonies meant to enforce power. They were communities, homes where Greek families could live alongside Persian and Indian neighbors, sharing not only roads, but hearts and minds. Children born into these communities inherited something rare. They grew up with the ability to see the world from multiple perspectives. They learned Greek logic and debate, Indian meditation and self-inquiry, Persian principles of tolerance and organization. Their lives were living proof that the boundaries between cultures are softer than we imagine. Over the generations that followed, many of these children would encounter the Buddhist teachings spreading gently across the region. For them, Buddhism felt familiar and welcoming. It spoke to their analytical Greek minds and their contemplative Indian hearts. It offered practical methods for compassion and peace while appealing to reason and inquiry. They did not have to choose between two worlds. They were already standing at the bridge. The communities Alexander encouraged continued to thrive for centuries. They became hubs of cultural and philosophical exchange. Trade routes carried silk, spices, and precious stones, but just as importantly, they carried ideas. Monks, merchants, and philosophers traveled these roads, sharing stories and wisdom across mountains and deserts. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of this period was the curiosity that endured. The Greeks of Gandhara never stopped asking the great questions that had animated Socrates and Plato. How should we live? What is the nature of happiness? How can we find peace in an uncertain world? When these questions met the Buddhist answers, compassion, mindfulness, the understanding of suffering, a profound synthesis began to take shape. Alexander's arrival in Gandhara then was far more than a military milestone. It was the planting of seeds of understanding, of curiosity, of cross-cultural friendship. Seeds that would bloom into something the world had never seen before. A meeting of Greek rationality and Indian wisdom that would echo across millennia. The stage was now set for the extraordinary encounters we will explore in the next chapter. Moments where wisdom looked across cultural lines and recognized itself. Where truth spoke many languages but always said the same thing. Peace is possible and understanding belongs to all who seek it.
Two teachers, one era. Between the years 480 and 400 BCE, a mere heartbeat in the vast timeline of human history, something extraordinary unfolded. Across two distant lands, separated by thousands of miles, and with no knowledge of each other's existence, two remarkable teachers emerged. One walked barefoot along dusty paths beneath the Himalayan foothills. The other strolled the sunlit marble streets of Athens, conversing with artisans, statesmen, and youths in the bustling agora. Neither man ever heard the other's name. They spoke different languages, lived within entirely different religious and cultural frameworks, and yet their lives unfolded in uncanny synchrony.
It is as if the universe itself orchestrated a symphony of awakening, sounding two distinct yet harmonious notes on opposite sides of the world. In the north of India, in the small Shakya kingdom near the Himalayan frontier, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama renounced a life of privilege in search of truth. The world would remember him as the Buddha, the awakened one. He is believed to have lived for 80 years, roughly between 480 and 400 BCE. During those decades, he reshaped the spiritual imagination of India and planted seeds that would eventually influence countless cultures. Meanwhile, in Greece, a man named Socrates wandered the streets of Athens, questioning politicians, merchants, soldiers, and poets. Unlike Siddhartha, Socrates had no royal lineage, but he shared the same tireless curiosity and courage to question the foundations of conventional wisdom. His life stretched from 469 to 399 BCE. Remarkably, these two transformative figures died within a single year of each other, an astonishing overlap given the isolation of their worlds. Why does this timing matter? Because it reveals something profound. Humanity itself seemed ready for a new way of understanding life. Across continents, cultures were questioning old certainties. People were struggling with suffering, injustice, and the mysteries of existence. And in both Athens and the Ganges Valley, two voices arose, teaching strikingly similar ideas. That wisdom is not the privilege of priests or kings, that each person carries within themselves the potential for clarity, compassion, and peace. The Buddha's Revolution. To appreciate Siddhartha's radical insight, we must picture the religious landscape of ancient India. Spiritual authority was dominated by the Brahmins, a hereditary priestly class. The prevailing belief was that salvation or liberation depended on birth and ritual. To approach the divine, one needed the proper lineage, elaborate sacrifices, and the intercession of priests who claimed exclusive access to sacred truth. Ordinary people had little direct agency over their spiritual fate. The gods were seen as beings who could be appeased or angered by ritual performance, and the meaning of life was interpreted through complex ceremonies beyond most people's understanding. Into this world stepped the Buddha with an idea that was quietly revolutionary. He redefines karma. Where karma had been seen as a matter of ritual actions, performing sacrifices correctly, observing the proper rites, the Buddha shifted the focus inward. Karma, he said, is primarily about intention. It is the moral quality of your actions and the motivations behind them. You did not need to be born into a priestly caste to cultivate wisdom. You did not need to rely on ritual experts to mediate between you and the divine. Your own choices, the way you speak, act, and think, were the seeds that shaped your destiny. Each moment of life provided an opportunity to sow seeds of suffering or seeds of peace. This was unprecedented. The Buddha taught that the true arena of spiritual development was the human heart and mind. Liberation was not handed down by gods or guaranteed by birthright. It was cultivated through awareness, compassion, and ethical living. Picture how shocking this must have been to his contemporaries. A prince turned wandering teacher telling farmers, artisans, and even outcasts that they possessed within themselves the capacity for awakening. That each of them could learn to see reality clearly, respond to life with compassion, and discover unshakable peace. It is difficult to overstate how radical this was in a culture structured by rigid social hierarchies. Socrates' quiet revolution. On the other side of the world, in sun-drenched Athens, a similar transformation was taking place. Greek thinkers had long speculated about cosmic mysteries. What is the universe made of? What moves the stars? What are the fundamental elements of reality? Philosophers such as Thales, Pythagoras, and Heraclitus sought answers in mathematics, cosmology, and abstract metaphysics. Socrates did something different. He brought philosophy down from the heavens and into the streets. Instead of speculating about the cosmos, he asked deeply practical questions. What is justice? What does it mean to live a good life? How do we distinguish true knowledge from mere opinion? Like the Buddha, Socrates shifted the center of inquiry inward. His famous declaration, "The unexamined life is not worth living," encapsulates his conviction that wisdom begins with self-awareness. He believed that genuine understanding could only emerge when individuals questioned their own assumptions, examined their lives honestly, and sought truth not from oracles or priests, but through reason and dialogue. His method, now known as the Socratic method, involved relentless questioning. Socrates would engage Athenians in conversations that revealed contradictions in their thinking. Far from aiming to humiliate, his questions were designed to help people clarify their own beliefs and discover deeper truths. This was profoundly unsettling to Athens' power structures. Just as the Buddha challenged the Brahmins' monopoly on spiritual authority, Socrates challenged Athens' cultural and political elites. He encouraged ordinary citizens to think critically and refused to accept authority without reasoned justification. Parallel insights. Despite their cultural differences, Siddhartha and Socrates were exploring the same essential terrain, the human mind and its capacity for transformation. Both taught that wisdom and ethical living were not about blind obedience, but about conscious engagement. The Buddha developed what we might call an early science of the mind. He instructed his followers to observe their thoughts and emotions with mindfulness, to see how craving, anger, and ignorance create suffering, and to cultivate habits of compassion and equanimity. His path was practical, systematic, and open to anyone regardless of caste or education. Socrates, too, believed that wisdom was not the exclusive property of scholars or priests. He engaged with craftspeople, soldiers, and politicians alike, showing that anyone willing to question and reflect could discover deeper ethical truths. Like the Buddha, he emphasized that virtue and understanding are inseparable, that knowledge is not merely intellectual but must be lived. Both men faced resistance. The Brahmins saw the Buddha's teaching as a threat to their social dominance. Athens' leaders accused Socrates of corrupting the youth and questioning the gods. Both charges reflected the same underlying fear, that these teachers were undermining conventional hierarchies by empowering individuals to think and act for themselves. Living examples of wisdom. Perhaps the most compelling testimony to their insights is how each man faced adversity and death. The Buddha's serenity in the face of illness and criticism showed the inner freedom he had realized. Socrates, condemned to death, continued discussing philosophy with his friends in prison, calmly drinking the Hamlet rather than fleeing in fear. Their lives were their greatest teachings. They demonstrated that it is possible to live with courage, compassion, and clarity even when the world resists change. They embodied a timeless truth, that real freedom is inner freedom, and true authority is found not in external power, but in wisdom and compassion. A global awakening. The fact that these insights arose independently in cultures with no contact suggests something profound. Humanity itself was awakening to a deeper understanding of the human condition. Scholars call this period the Axial Age, when thinkers from Greece to India to China began exploring similar themes: justice, compassion, self-awareness, and the possibility of inner transformation. The seeds planted by the Buddha and Socrates would continue to grow for centuries. Their ideas would eventually meet, Greek philosophical thought blending with Indian wisdom during the cultural exchanges that followed Alexander's campaigns. When Buddhist teachers and Greek philosophers finally encountered each other in Gandhara centuries later, they recognized familiar truths expressed in new forms. Both traditions had discovered independently that human beings possess remarkable capacities for wisdom and peace, and that these capacities can be cultivated intentionally. Conclusion. The parallel lives of the Buddha and Socrates remind us that wisdom is universal. It arises wherever human beings honestly confront life's deepest questions. How should we live? How do we respond to suffering? What is justice? What does it mean to be truly free? Though separated by mountains and seas, by language and culture, these two teachers discovered that the answers lie not in rituals or decrees, but in the heart and mind of each individual. Their legacy is not only the philosophies and religions that grew from their teachings, but the enduring possibility they represent, that any person, anywhere, can awaken to wisdom and compassion.
The first Western Buddhists. In the high valleys of ancient Gandhara, where the snow-fed rivers tumble down from the Hindu Kush and the air carries the mingled fragrances of pine, dust, and incense, something quietly extraordinary was unfolding. It was not an empire being built or a conquest being waged, but a meeting of hearts and minds that would change the spiritual history of the world. Long before Buddhism reached China, Japan, or Thailand, a different journey was happening. Far from the Ganges plain where Siddhartha Gautama had taught centuries earlier, the children and grandchildren of Greeks who had followed Alexander's armies east found themselves in a land far different from the sun-drenched coasts of the Aegean. They had built homes among Persians, Indians, and Central Asians, maintaining their language, their love for philosophy, their curiosity about the cosmos. Yet, life on this eastern edge of the known world was not without its challenges. These transplanted Greek families, descendants of soldiers, artisans, administrators, carried with them the proud traditions of Athens and Ionia. They cherished the dialectic methods of Socrates and the rational curiosity of Aristotle. They recited Homer and debated Plato. But in the rigid social structure of the Indian subcontinent, they were outsiders. The Brahmanical system of caste and ritual had no place for these newcomers. To the priestly elite, these foreigners were mlecha, outside the sacred social order, unworthy of full participation. For Greek parents who had worked hard to preserve their culture across generations, and for their children born on Indian soil, this lack of recognition stung deeply. Imagine their frustration. No matter how well they spoke local languages, no matter how kindly they lived, their social worth was determined not by character, but by ancestry. This tension created a hunger, a longing for meaning and belonging, and it was into this yearning that a new possibility entered. By the time of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, Buddhist monks were traveling along trade routes and cultural highways, spreading the teachings of the Buddha with quiet dedication. These monks were not armed conquerors. They carried no swords, only words and presence. They came not to dominate, but to invite. And in the Greek communities of Gandhara, they found receptive listeners. What the Greeks heard astonished them. Here was a teaching that shattered the rigid hierarchies of caste. The Buddha's message was radically inclusive. It did not matter where you were born, what gods your ancestors worshipped, or what rituals you practiced. What mattered was your own mind and heart. Could you live with compassion? Could you free yourself from greed and hatred? Could you seek wisdom and liberation not only for yourself, but for all beings? For Greeks accustomed to being labeled as outsiders, this teaching felt like a door flung open. Suddenly, they were not outcasts, they were equals. They were welcome not as tolerated guests, but as full participants in a community of seekers. But the appeal went even deeper. Buddhism's rational and experiential approach to truth resonated with the Greek philosophical temperament. The Buddha did not demand blind faith. He invited direct investigation. Come and see, his teachings implied. Observe your mind, examine your suffering,
Test these teachings in your own life. This mirrored what Socrates had done in Athens centuries earlier, leading dialogues that questioned assumptions and invited people to discover truth through self-examination. The Greeks of Gandhara recognized a familiar spirit in these saffron-robed monks. Here was philosophy not as abstract speculation, but as a living practice. And so, some of these Greeks did more than listen. They went all in. They shaved their heads, donned robes, and entered monasteries as Buddhist monks. This was no small thing. To leave behind family and possessions, to dedicate one's life to meditation and ethical discipline was a profound step. We know some of their names because they carved them into history, literally. Inscriptions on ancient stone pillars from Ashoka's empire mention two extraordinary figures, Dharmarakshita and Mahadharmarakshita. Their very names are Sanskritized, yet their origins were unmistakably Greek. These were Western men who had so deeply understood and embodied Buddhist teachings that they became not just monks, but teachers and missionaries. Ancient chronicles from Sri Lanka, like the Dipavamsa and the Mahavamsa, confirm their roles. Dharmarakshita, the protector of Dharma, became renowned for teaching the Abhidharma, the intricate analysis of the mind that mapped consciousness with almost scientific precision. Can you imagine how naturally this would have appealed to a Greek-trained mind? These were people who loved categorizing the stars and dissecting logical arguments. Now they turned that same analytic brilliance inward, charting the constellations of thought and emotion. But perhaps the most remarkable detail is what happened next. These Greek monks were not content to simply practice quietly. They were entrusted with one of the most important missions of early Buddhism, carrying the Dharma to others. Records tell us they traveled to other Greek-speaking communities, teaching the path of compassion and wisdom in familiar cultural terms. The Mahavamsa even describes a stunning scene. During the dedication of a great stupa in Sri Lanka, a delegation arrived from Alessandria, very likely Alexandria of the Caucasus, a city founded by Alexander. Among them was Mahadharmarakshita, leading what the chronicles poetically number as 30,000 monks. Whether literal or symbolic, the point is clear. Buddhism had not only reached the Greek world, it had flourished there. Picture it. Thousands of monks of Greek heritage, their ancestors once worshippers of Zeus and Athena, now chanting verses of loving kindness in Pali or Sanskrit. Their presence alone refutes the notion that wisdom traditions belong to one culture. Here, in the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan, the first Western Buddhists were living proof that truth is universal. And their impact rippled outward. Sri Lankan monks traveled north to learn from Dharmarakshita's teachings. Techniques for preserving the Dharma in written form, something the Greeks deeply valued, helped ensure Buddhism's survival during later times of turmoil. Gandharan art, blending Greek sculptural realism with Buddhist themes, would go on to influence how the Buddha was depicted across Asia. But beyond all these historical contributions, the heart of the story is simple and beautiful. People from vastly different backgrounds met in the shared human longing to end suffering and live wisely. There were no forced conversions, no imperial decrees, no armies marching under religious banners. There was only the gentle meeting of curiosity and compassion. Greek intellectual rigor encountered Buddhist experiential wisdom, and together they created something new, a bridge between worlds. This matters profoundly for us today. In an age when divisions of culture, religion, and nationality often dominate headlines, the story of the first Western Buddhists whispers a different truth. Wisdom knows no borders. The human heart's longing for peace is the same in Athens and in Gandhara, in Sri Lanka and in Seattle, in 3rd century BCE, and in the 21st century CE. As we reflect on this meeting of worlds, imagine what it must have felt like for those early Greek Buddhists. To find a tradition that saw beyond birth and caste, beyond labels and boundaries. To sit in meditation among Indian, Persian, and Central Asian monks, breathing the same breath, listening to the same teachings, and realizing this path is for all of us. And perhaps the most powerful legacy of these first Western Buddhists is not just historical, it's personal. The same practices that transformed their lives are available to us now. Mindfulness, compassion meditation, ethical living, these are not Eastern or Western, but human practices. The Greeks of Gandhara discovered this 2,300 years ago. Their stone-carved names still speak across the centuries: Dharmarakshita, Mahadharmarakshita. They are reminders that wisdom travels, that hearts can open, that cultures can meet without clashing, and that the human longing for peace is older and deeper than any border. And maybe, just maybe, as you listen to their story, you can feel a spark of that same recognition. The quiet joy of realizing that the path to awakening has always been open to all who seek it. The mountains of Gandhara are quiet now, but their echoes remain. The first Western Buddhists walked those paths, and their footsteps lead forward, inviting us still.
King Menander's questions: when Greek curiosity met Buddhist wisdom. About 150 years before the Common Era, in the vibrant cities of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, there lived a king whose name would echo through Buddhist history. His Greek name was Menander I, but in the Buddhist chronicles, he is remembered with fondness as Milinda. His reign stretched across territories in what is today Afghanistan and northern India, lands where the legacies of Alexander the Great, Persian tolerance, and Indian spirituality had already been mingling for centuries. Menander was not an ordinary king. While most rulers of his age devoted their energy to expanding borders and managing armies, Menander was animated by a different kind of ambition. He wanted answers, not just about politics or economics, but about life's deepest mysteries. His story represents one of the most beautiful examples in human history of what becomes possible when genuine curiosity meets profound wisdom. A cosmopolitan crossroads. To understand Menander's questions, we need to picture the world he inherited. The Gandharharan valleys where he ruled were already a remarkable cultural crossroads. Persian imperial traditions had fostered tolerance and administration. Greek settlers left behind by Alexander had brought their philosophical heritage. Indian sages had long cultivated deep contemplative traditions. In Menander's time, Buddhist monks moved freely through marketplaces, forests, and cities. They wore simple saffron robes and carried alms bowls, teaching anyone interested about the Buddhist insights into suffering and its cessation. Alongside them were Greek philosophers, heirs to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, still devoted to dialogue and rational inquiry. Menander grew up in this rich intellectual environment. He learned Greek logic and rhetoric, but he also witnessed Buddhist compassion and meditative practices. Over time, his restless mind began asking questions his Greek ancestors would have recognized. What is justice? What makes a human life meaningful? Why does suffering seem to haunt even the most fortunate lives? But unlike his ancestors, Menander also had access to a living spiritual tradition offering practical methods for transcending suffering. He suspected that the Greek love for reason and the Buddhist path of compassion were not opposed but complementary. A king who sought wisdom beyond power. Menander's curiosity wasn't idle. The ancient Buddhist text called the Milinda Panya, the Questions of King Milinda, preserves the memory of his spiritual quest. It tells us that he actively sought out Buddhist monks for discussion, not as a pastime, but with an urgent desire to understand life's deeper truths. Despite his philosophical training, Menander was dissatisfied. He saw that political power could not protect him from aging, illness, or death.
He saw that wealth and luxury brought no lasting peace. Like many thoughtful people throughout history, he wondered if there was a deeper way of living. But most monks he met could not satisfy his penetrating inquiries. Menander's questions were not hostile. He wasn't trying to defeat anyone in debate. But his mind was sharp and his philosophical standards were rigorous. He wanted answers that could stand up to logical examination and also transform life practically. Word eventually reached him about a remarkable monk named Nagasena. Nagasena, the sage who could speak to a Greek king. Nagasena was uniquely suited for dialogue with Menander. He was deeply learned in the Abhidharma, the Buddhist psychological analysis of mind and experience, but he was not a mere academic. He had attained what Buddhists call arahantship, direct realization of freedom from suffering. He could explain Buddhist teachings not only with logical clarity, but from lived experience. Even more remarkably, Nagasena had studied with teachers influenced by earlier Greek Buddhists such as Dharmarakita, whom we explored in the previous chapter. This meant Nagasena understood both Buddhist thought and the Greek philosophical temperament. He could meet Menander where he was. Their meeting became legendary. The Milinda Panya records their dialogue as one of the most sophisticated cross-cultural philosophical conversations in history. And unlike the competitive debates of some Greek schools, their exchanges were marked by deep mutual respect. The great questions: identity, change, and ethics. What did Menander ask? His questions were timeless, the very same that thoughtful people still ask today. If everything is impermanent, what makes a person the same from childhood to adulthood? If there is no eternal soul, how can there be rebirth? Who reaps the fruits of karma? How can ethical responsibility make sense without a permanent self? These were not trivial puzzles. They struck at the heart of Buddhist philosophy. Nagasena answered using vivid analogies and careful reasoning. He explained that what we call a person is like a chariot, a collection of parts assembled in a functional way. There is no fixed essence called chariotness, yet the vehicle functions. Likewise, the self is a collection of ever-changing physical and mental components. There is continuity, but not permanent. Rebirth, he said, was like lighting one candle from another. The flame is neither identical nor completely separate. Ethical actions shape the process even if there is no unchanging soul. These explanations amazed Menander. They satisfied his logical rigor and also pointed toward a path of practice. For the first time, he saw a way to bridge Greek rational analysis with a transformative spiritual discipline. Beyond philosophy, a king transformed. The Milinda Panya suggests that Menander's encounter with Nagasena changed him profoundly. Later tradition even claims he renounced his throne to become a monk, a detail that may be legendary, but there's no doubt Buddhism became deeply important to him. Archaeological evidence supports this. Coins from Menander's reign depict Buddhist symbols alongside Greek ones. Some bear inscriptions calling him Dhammika, a follower of the Dharma. A reliquary found in modern-day Pakistan bears an inscription referring to the reign of Maharaja Menander connected with relics of the Buddha. Even the Greek historian Plutarch mentions that when Menander died, his ashes were distributed among cities and enshrined in memorials, likely Buddhist stupas. This suggests his status among Buddhist communities was extraordinary. Why Menander's questions still matter? The story of Menander and Nagasena is not just a historical curiosity, it carries a message urgently relevant today. It shows that wisdom transcends culture. A Greek king and an Indian monk, men from completely different worlds, found common ground in their shared humanity and longing for truth. Their dialogue shows that rational inquiry and contemplative practice are not enemies. Philosophy asks deep questions, meditation provides practical tools for experiencing the answers directly. Together, they create a holistic path to wisdom. In an age when cultures often clash and misunderstand each other, the example of Menander and Nagasena is luminous. It demonstrates that when people meet in humility and curiosity, wisdom can flow across boundaries. A legacy that still echoes. The influence of Menander's questions would ripple far beyond his lifetime. Gandharan art soon began depicting the Buddha in human form using Greco-Roman artistic conventions. Buddhist texts were eventually written down using scripts derived from Greek literacy traditions. The very mindfulness and meditation practices millions rely on today trace some of their early spread to moments like this, when East met West with respect and openness. Menander's restless curiosity found its answer in Nagasena's profound wisdom, and in doing so, he left us a story that continues to inspire seekers over 2,000 years later. Conclusion: what are your questions? As we reflect on Menander's story, perhaps the most important takeaway is that spiritual inquiry begins with sincere questions. Menander asked, "Who am I? What endures? How can I live wisely?" These are your questions too, and mine. They transcend time and culture. And just like Menander, we find ourselves in a world where wisdom traditions meet, where philosophy, psychology, and contemplative practice can speak to one another. The Milinda Panya ends not with a final answer, but with an invitation to continue the inquiry. Menander's story reminds us that the path to peace begins when we dare to ask.
The gift of writing, a journey across time. Deep in the silent caves of Afghanistan, among the dust of centuries and the whisper of forgotten winds, archaeologists have uncovered something astonishing. Carefully sealed pottery jars containing fragile fragments of birch bark scrolls, each scroll inscribed with delicate letters in an ancient script. At first glance, they might look like brittle scraps of wood, but what they carry is extraordinary. Some of the oldest Buddhist manuscripts ever found, over 2,000 years old. These texts are not just relics of a distant past. They hold the earliest written record of wisdom traditions that millions today still rely on, for calm in anxious times, for insight in moments of confusion, and for a sense of peace in a world that often feels chaotic. They are, in a very real sense, gifts. Gifts of writing, gifts of memory, and gifts of survival. But to understand why this discovery matters, we have to step back, far back, to a time when all sacred knowledge lived not on paper or screens, but in human memory alone. When wisdom lived in the breath and voice. In the Buddha's lifetime, around the 5th century BCE, and for centuries afterward, there was no tradition in India of writing down sacred or philosophical teachings. The Buddha's words, his insights on suffering, peace, ethics, and freedom were spoken, memorized, and passed along like music, carried by unbroken chains of voices. This wasn't unusual. Many ancient cultures believed that the most sacred truths should live in living beings, not on cold stone or fragile bark. Among the Brahmins, the Vedic hymns had been preserved orally for hundreds of years before any script appeared. Their memorization methods were astonishingly precise, layer upon layer of recitation patterns designed to ensure that not a syllable changed across generations. The Buddha's community adopted similar methods. After his death, councils of monks gathered to chant and recite his teachings together, line by line, word by word, as a way to ensure accuracy. His discourses, suttas, and the rules for monastic life, Vinaya, were not written down, but there is no record that he ever forbade writing either. He seemed far less interested in how wisdom would be preserved and far more concerned with whether it was truly practiced. A different world, Greece and the written word. Meanwhile, far to the west, a different relationship to knowledge was evolving. By the 8th century BCE, the Greeks had developed a fully functional alphabet, one of the most powerful intellectual tools in human history. They wrote epic poems, laws, philosophical treatises, and scientific observations. For the Greeks, writing was more than memory storage. It was a tool for inquiry. It allowed thinkers like Plato and Aristotle to refine their arguments, preserve dialogues, and build systems of thought that could be revisited and critiqued by later generations. Libraries emerged, physical repositories of collective wisdom. When Alexander the Great's expeditions reached as far as India in the 4th century BCE, this literate culture met the oral traditions of the East. Along the borderlands of Central Asia, modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, Greek settlers established cities, married into local families, and began a slow but profound cultural exchange. Persian policies of tolerance had already created space for pluralism in these regions, but now something new emerged. In places like Gandhara, Greek and Indian worlds began quietly learning from each other. The sudden appearance of Indian script. For centuries, there had been almost no archaeological evidence of writing in India. Then, in the 3rd century BCE, something remarkable happened. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, one of the most influential figures in Buddhist history, began erecting his famous stone pillars. Across his vast empire, carved in multiple languages and scripts, were messages promoting ethical conduct, compassion, and sometimes even direct quotations attributed to the Buddha. In the northwestern regions of Ashoka's empire, those pillars included Greek and Aramaic inscriptions, reflecting the linguistic diversity of his subjects. Scholars believe that Ashoka deliberately commissioned the Brahmi script, the ancestor of most modern Indian scripts, for this project. Its sudden appearance suggests careful planning and the involvement of people already familiar with writing systems, possibly influenced by Persian and Greek scribal traditions. For the first time, Buddhist ethics and wisdom teachings appeared not just in memory and chant, but carved into stone. Permanent, public, and enduring. The Gandharan scrolls, where cultures met. While Ashoka's stone edicts were aimed at the public, a more intimate and remarkable development was taking place further north in Gandhara. Here, Buddhist teachings were being carefully written down on birch bark scrolls in a script called Karoshtoti, which itself evolved from Aramaic scripts brought by earlier empires. These scrolls contain suttas, discourses of the Buddha, and other Buddhist texts in Gandhari Prakrit, the spoken language of everyday people. Unlike the later Sanskrit canon, these were not written in elite scholarly language, but in words common people used. It reflects something essential about Buddhism, its commitment to accessibility. Wisdom was not meant to be locked away for a select few, but shared as widely as possible. Scientific dating has shown that some of these scrolls are from the 2nd century BCE, making them the oldest known Buddhist manuscripts in existence. And where were they found? Precisely in the regions where Greek settlers, Persian administrators, and Buddhist monks had been interacting for generations. Writing becomes sacred. What's moving about these discoveries is not just their age, but the care with which they were preserved. Many scrolls were stored in clay jars, placed deep within caves or monastic sites. They were not discarded texts, they were treated like relics. The physical act of writing itself seems to have been seen as sacred. In some Buddhist communities, copying the Dharma became a devotional act, a way of making merit and honoring the Buddha's words. This reverence helped ensure that even when oral transmission was disrupted by wars, migration, or the passing of elders, the teachings could still survive. A parallel story, Sri Lanka and the Great Writing Project.
A similar pattern unfolded far to the south. In Sri Lanka, the Buddhist canon was preserved orally for centuries after it arrived from India. But around the 1st century BCE, social upheavals and famine threatened the survival of these monastic communities. The ancient chronicles, the Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa, describe a massive undertaking at the Aluvihara monastery. For the first time, the entire Tipitaka, Buddhist canon, was written down. Monks worked systematically to record the vast body of teachings, ensuring that they would survive even if oral recitation could not continue uninterrupted. What's fascinating is that these chronicles also mention Sri Lankan monks who had traveled north to study under teachers influenced by Greek traditions, including the legendary Greek Buddhist monk Dharmarakshita, Dharmakeshma. Some monks learned analytical and systematic methods of study that merit the Greek love of reason and structure. When they returned, they likely brought with them not only philosophical methods, but models for how written preservation could safeguard wisdom. The gift beyond time. These developments, the Gandharan scrolls, the Sri Lankan writing project, Ashoka's inscriptions, were not isolated. They reflect a broader shift in how humanity learned to protect and share its deepest insights. The marriage of Greek literacy and Buddhist insight created something unprecedented, a way to preserve teachings not just for one generation, but for thousands of years. The birch bark scrolls we find today, carefully stored for millennia, are proof of that. They also remind us of something else. Wisdom is fragile. It depends on human effort, whether that's the chanting monks of ancient India or the scribes painstakingly copying suttas on delicate bark. It depends on cultural exchange, people willing to learn from each other across languages and traditions. And it depends on reverence, the recognition that some truths are so precious they deserve to be carried forward no matter the cost. Why this matters today? What does all of this mean for us? You might be listening to this while scrolling through your phone, while a meditation app guides your breath. You might have read quotes from the Dhammapada on a social feed. These practices feel modern, but they rest on a foundation laid thousands of years ago, on birch bark and stone pillars, in the meeting of Greek curiosity and Buddhist compassion. The scrolls in those caves are not just history. They are living reminders that wisdom transcends borders. The questions those ancient monks preserved about suffering, peace, and the meaning of life are the same questions we ask today. And thanks to the gift of writing, their answers are still here for us.
Art bridges worlds, the story of Hercules and Vajrapani. In the dusty valleys and rugged mountain passes of ancient Gandhara, where present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan meet, archaeologists began uncovering something that puzzled and amazed them. Among the ruins of Buddhist monasteries and temples, nestled amid fragments of stupas and sculpted friezes, they encountered an image that seemed completely out of place. Carved into stone, standing protectively beside serene figures of the Buddha, was a muscular man with a thick beard and a powerful stance. In one hand, he held a massive club. His body exuded strength and vigor. Anyone familiar with Greek mythology would recognize him immediately. Heracles, or Hercules, the legendary hero famed for his 12 labors, a figure celebrated in stories from Athens to Alexandria. But how could Hercules have found his way into a Buddhist temple, thousands of kilometers from Greece and centuries removed from his mythic homeland? Was this a mistake? A coincidence? Or was it evidence of something far deeper and more extraordinary? As excavations continued over the 19th and 20th centuries, the mystery only grew more fascinating. Hercules was not an isolated anomaly. Similar figures appeared repeatedly across Gandharan Buddhist sites, from Taxila to Hada, from Peshawar to Bamiyan. And these depictions were not hidden. They were deliberately placed in prominent positions,
often standing guard behind the seated or standing Buddha, almost like a divine bodyguard. Even more intriguingly, these figures evolved over time. The earliest versions look unmistakably Greek, a muscular torso, lion skin draped over one arm, holding the classic club of Heracles. But later images shifted. The club became stylized into a vajra, the ritual thunderbolt weapon associated with Buddhist symbolism. The face softened, the stance became more formal, less heroic warrior, and more compassionate protector. The bearded Greek hero over centuries transformed into Vajrapani, one of Mahayana Buddhism's most revered bodhisattvas, the protector and guide of the Buddha. Today, virtually every major Buddhist tradition includes Vajrapani in its iconography. Millions of Buddhists across East and Central Asia venerate him as a symbol of power, compassion, and protection. Yet few realize that the artistic DNA of this bodhisattva can be traced directly back to the Greek hero Heracles. A meeting of worlds, Gandhara and cultural fusion. To understand how this happened, we need to journey back over 2,000 years. Gandhara was not just a remote frontier, it was a vibrant crossroads of cultures. By the 4th century BCE, after Alexander the Great's campaigns, Greek settlers and soldiers established communities across Central Asia. Decades later, the region came under the rule of the Mauryan Empire, followed by Indo-Greek kingdoms that thrived on trade along the Silk Road. Here, Greek artistic traditions met Buddhist philosophy. Gandharan artisans were trained in Hellenistic realism, with its love of lifelike anatomy, flowing drapery, and dramatic expressions. But now they faced a new challenge: how to depict Buddhist concepts, compassion, serenity, enlightenment, and protection using their artistic toolkit. Before Gandhara, early Indian Buddhist art was largely symbolic. The Buddha was not shown as a human figure. Instead, his presence was indicated by footprints, an empty throne, or a sacred tree. But the Greek-trained sculptors of Gandhara introduced a radical innovation: anthropomorphic depictions of the Buddha himself. They drew upon their traditions of sculpting gods and heroes to give the Buddha a serene human form, draped in robes like a Greek philosopher, with a calm expression that radiated spiritual insight. Alongside the Buddha came other figures: bodhisattvas, protective deities, attendants. The need for a visual protector of the Buddha inspired artists to draw upon a figure already familiar to them: Hercules. To Greek eyes, Heracles symbolized strength in service of righteousness. He was not just a brute warrior, but a hero whose labors benefited humanity. This made him the perfect template for a Buddhist guardian. And thus, Hercules began his metamorphosis. Over time, his identity fused with Buddhist symbolism. His club became a vajra, his expression softened, and his mythic narrative dissolved into a new cultural role. By the 1st century CE, Vajrapani emerged fully formed, a bodhisattva of power and compassion. What Gandhara teaches us about cultural creativity. The Gandharan Hercules Vajrapani is more than an art historical curiosity. It's a profound lesson about how cultures interact. When different civilizations meet, whether through trade, migration, or conquest, they often exchange more than goods. They share ideas, symbols, and stories, adapting them in ways that make sense to their new context. The artists of Gandhara were not trying to deceive anyone or hide their sources. They weren't copying Greek art, they were solving a real cultural problem: how to express Buddhist truths in a visual language that could speak to a multi-ethnic audience. In a region where Greeks, Persians, Indians, and Central Asians all mingled, Hercules was a recognizable symbol of heroic protection. By reshaping him into Vajrapani, Gandharan artists created an image that resonated with everyone. This kind of cultural bridge building is not unique to ancient Gandhara. We see it today whenever ideas cross borders and adapt to new settings, when mindfulness meditation is integrated into Western psychology, when yoga is practiced by people far removed from its Indian origins, when Western science and Eastern philosophy engage in dialogue. These are all modern echoes of the same process that transformed Hercules into Vajrapani 2,000 years ago. Art as a universal language. The Gandharan sculptures remind us that art is not bound by national or religious borders. It is a universal language of symbols and emotions. Hercules, once a Greek hero, could become a Buddhist bodhisattva because both traditions valued strength devoted to goodness. Similarly, the Gandharan Buddhist statues, with their Greco-Roman drapery and Indian spiritual symbolism, could inspire devotion from Greeks and Indians alike. And this blending had lasting influence. The Gandharan style traveled eastward along the Silk Road, shaping Buddhist art in China, Korea, and Japan. Even today, if you look at East Asian images of Vajrapani, you can see faint echoes of the muscular Greek hero who once stood guard in Gandharan monasteries. The deeper meaning of Hercules in a Buddhist temple. What makes the Hercules Vajrapani story so moving is its underlying message. It suggests that wisdom traditions recognize and honor each other when they meet with openness and respect. The artists of Gandhara did not reject foreign symbols. They embraced them and reshaped them for a new spiritual purpose. Every time someone today lights incense before Vajrapani or prays for his protection, they are participating in this ancient dialogue between Greece and India. Every time someone admires a Gandharan sculpture in a museum, they are witnessing history's quiet reminder that cultures grow richer when they connect. A legacy of bridges, not walls. The carvings of Gandhara are more than stone. They are bridges across time and space. They show us that cultural fusion is not dilution, it's enrichment. The Greek hero and the Buddhist bodhisattva are not opposites. They are two expressions of the same universal human longing to protect what is good and help others find peace. In an age when cultural divisions often dominate headlines, Gandhara's art offers a hopeful counter-narrative. It tells us that the meeting of worlds can give birth to beauty that transcends boundaries. So the next time you see an image of Vajrapani in a Buddhist temple, remember the journey it represents. Behind the compassionate protector stands the memory of Hercules, the Greek hero who crossed mountains and centuries to guard the Buddha. And behind both stands something even greater, the human capacity to learn from one another and to create symbols that unite rather than divide.
Voices from the Earth, the lost scrolls of Gandhara. In the high deserts and jagged mountains of Afghanistan, history often sleeps hidden for millennia until the earth decides to speak. In 1995, the world of Buddhist studies was rocked by a discovery that began not in a museum or a university, but in the shadowy alleys of the antiquities market. A mysterious collection of ancient manuscripts appeared for sale, passed quietly between dealers. No one would say exactly where they came from, which is not unusual in the clandestine world of ancient artifacts. But the rumors were irresistible. These were scrolls unlike anything ever seen before, found somewhere in the rugged mountains that had once been crossroads for Greek settlers, Persian merchants, Indian pilgrims, and wandering monks. When scholars finally gained access to these fragile relics, their hands shook as they unrolled them. Each manuscript was made not of paper or parchment, but of birch bark, thin, papery layers peeled from trees that grow high in Central Asia.
On these curling scrolls, written in a faded brown ink, was text in Kharoshthi script, an ancient writing system derived from Aramaic, and the language was Gandhari Prakrit, the everyday speech of the people who once lived in this multicultural frontier. What the scrolls contained would rewrite Buddhist history, older than anyone thought possible. The texts were Buddhist teachings, remarkably familiar ones. They contained meditation instructions, ethical precepts, and reflections on the causes of suffering and the path to liberation. To any practicing Buddhist today, the words would have felt recognizable. They mirrored the same wisdom taught in monasteries from Sri Lanka to Japan, the same insights millions turn to for inner peace. And yet, the scrolls themselves carried an astonishing secret. Carbon dating revealed something no one had dared to imagine. These manuscripts were older than any other Buddhist texts ever discovered anywhere in the world. Some dated to the 1st century BCE, others perhaps even earlier. To put this in perspective, they were already ancient when Buddhist scriptures began to be translated into Chinese. They predated the Pali Canon manuscripts of Sri Lanka by centuries. This meant that someone in the mountains of Afghanistan was writing down Buddhist teachings within a century or two of the Buddha's own lifetime, long before the traditional narrative suggests Buddhism relied solely on oral transmission for hundreds of years. The idea that the Dharma was only preserved through memory for 5 centuries may need a radical rewrite. Sacred preservation. But the manuscripts revealed even more about the people who created and protected them. These were not scrolls tossed aside in the dirt or buried haphazardly. They had been carefully rolled, wrapped in cloth, and sealed inside clay pots. The kind of reverence typically reserved for the physical relics of saints and teachers was here extended to the written Dharma itself. It's humbling to imagine. Some anonymous monk or lay follower over 2,000 years ago painstakingly copying these words onto strips of birch bark, then gently placing them in containers, perhaps chanting prayers for their protection. They understood something profound, that wisdom is fragile and must be safeguarded for future generations who might desperately need it. And they succeeded. Across more than 20 centuries of war, conquest, empire, and collapse, those words endured, waiting patiently for the modern world to find them. An echo from the past, earlier discoveries and lost voices. This was not the first time Afghanistan's earth had whispered such secrets. As early as the 1800s, British archaeologists reported finding similar birch bark scrolls in the region. Unfortunately, the technology of the time was primitive. Many of those manuscripts disintegrated before anyone could read them. The 1995 cache was different. It had survived long enough for modern preservation techniques to work. Professor Richard Solomon at the University of Washington has spent decades studying these texts letter by letter. His research revealed something even more startling. These were copies, not originals. Tiny copying mistakes, like skipped lines or duplicated phrases, betrayed the scribe's task of working from an earlier exemplar, which means the originals were even older. If we have copies from the 1st century BCE, the originals could have been written down within living memory of the Buddhist death. We are reaching back into the dawn of Buddhist history itself. The Greek-Buddhist connection. And there's another twist, one that connects these manuscripts directly to the story of East-West cultural exchange. The scrolls were found in Gandhara, the same region where Greek settlers had lived for centuries after Alexander the Great's conquests. The Kharoshthi script itself shows clear influences from both Aramaic and Greek writing systems. The meticulous preservation methods mirror the Greek reverence for texts. These discoveries suggest that Greek and Buddhist cultures were not just neighbors, they were collaborators in the preservation and evolution of wisdom traditions. We already knew that Buddhist art in Gandhara borrowed Hellenistic styles. The Buddha dressed like a Greek philosopher, Hercules transformed into Vajrapani, but these manuscripts suggest that the exchange wasn't just artistic. It extended to how texts were copied, stored, and transmitted. Ashoka's voice in Greek. This cultural synthesis wasn't limited to manuscripts. In 1963, archaeologists working in Kandahar uncovered a Greek-language inscription carved in stone. It contained portions of Emperor Ashoka's famous edicts, the same proclamations about compassion and nonviolence found throughout India, but here translated into perfect Greek, intended for Greek-speaking communities actively practicing Buddhism as early as the 3rd century BCE. This wasn't some later translation, it was a contemporary adaptation. Imagine walking into a public square in Kandahar over 2,200 years ago and seeing Ashoka's Dharma message carved on stone in your own language. It's hard to overstate what this means. Buddhism wasn't an Eastern tradition trickling west centuries later. It was already multilingual, multicultural, globalizing from its earliest days. The Swat Valley Temple, a city of monks. And the discoveries haven't stopped. In 2018, Italian archaeologists led by Luca Olivieri uncovered an ancient Buddhist temple complex in the Swat Valley of Pakistan, dating back over 2,000 years. The site included meditation halls, stupas, monastic quarters, and artwork that blended Greek and Buddhist motifs. This was no small outpost. It was a thriving religious center in the very region where historical sources describe Greek monks learning the Dharma. The site showed continuous use for centuries, evidence that this wasn't a brief cultural experiment. It was a sustained flourishing of Buddhist practice in a cosmopolitan community. X-rays and scrolls. Technology meets ancient wisdom. New technologies are allowing us to hear even more voices from the earth. Scrolls too fragile to unroll are now being read using CT scanning techniques originally designed for medical imaging. These machines can peer through the rolled birch bark, reading texts that haven't been exposed to light for over 2,000 years. What are they finding? Even more surprises. Buddhist scriptures with no surviving parallels anywhere else in the world. Unique meditation manuals, lost ethical discourses. Entire schools of thought may have vanished everywhere except in these fragile mountain archives. Some texts are even written in Greek cursive script, praising Buddhas and Bodhisattvas like Avalokiteshvara. Others are in Bactrian, a local language, but still using the Greek alphabet. Evidence that the cultural synthesis wasn't superficial, it went deep into daily religious life. Greek letters, Buddhist wisdom, a legacy that lasted centuries. One detail astonishes scholars. Greek script continued to be used for Buddhist texts for nearly 800 years after Alexander's death. By the 3rd century CE, there were probably no identifiable ethnic Greeks left in the region. Intermarriage and cultural blending had erased those distinctions. And yet, Buddhist monks were still copying the Dharma using the alphabet of Homer and Plato. Professor Mario Walter notes that this suggests Greek contributions weren't a brief episode. They became a structural part of Buddhist culture in the region. The tools of preservation outlasted the people who brought them. Why this matters: ancient care for future suffering. The most powerful aspect of these discoveries isn't just historical trivia, it's their message. The people who rolled those birch bark scrolls and sealed them in clay jars weren't thinking about modern archaeologists or carbon dating. They were thinking about us, about future generations who might need the Dharma's wisdom. They understood that human beings would always suffer, would always need guidance on compassion, ethics, and inner peace. And so they hid their scrolls like treasures, trusting the earth to keep them safe. And the earth did. Across centuries of war, empire, and oblivion, the voices endured. Now, as modern people scan these scrolls with X-ray machines, the past speaks again. The earth is still speaking. Afghanistan's ongoing instability has made excavation difficult, but it has also left many ancient sites undisturbed. Scholars believe there are cave libraries still waiting to be discovered, sealed archives of Dharma yet to be found. Every year brings new fragments, new revelations. Each discovery reminds us, wisdom is fragile, but it is also resilient. Cultures meet, share, and transform. Languages change, empires.
The river continues, a 25th century journey of wisdom across worlds. As we reach the end of our journey through 25 centuries of cultural exchange, it's worth pausing to recognize something truly extraordinary. The stream of wisdom that began flowing between Greek and Buddhist communities in the rugged valleys of ancient Gandhara never dried up. Like a spring emerging in a quiet mountain crevice, it became a river that carved valleys, crossed continents, and eventually reached the vast ocean of humanity's collective heart. Those early encounters between East and West, between Greek rationality and Buddhist contemplation, did not remain locked in the mountain passes of Afghanistan. They traveled, they transformed, and even now they ripple through your life in ways those first Greek Buddhist monks could never have imagined. The path from those ancient valleys to your own spiritual seeking has been neither straight nor simple. Like all rivers, it has twisted and meandered. There have been rapids and droughts, floods and still pools. And yet it has continued flowing, carrying with it the same essential message that awakened seekers thousands of years ago. Suffering can be transformed through wisdom and compassion. The river's journey through Asia. Buddhism's journey across Asia was as much about adaptation as it was about preservation. In India, it grew from the Buddha's direct teachings into complex schools of philosophy and meditation. In China, it encountered Confucian ethics and Taoist mysticism. In Japan, it found a home in Shinto aesthetics and a deep reverence for simplicity and impermanence. In Tibet, it absorbed the language of ritual and visionary practice. In Southeast Asia, it integrated with cultures shaped by ancient animist traditions. Each region added its own colors and textures to the fabric of the Dharma, but woven invisibly through this tapestry was a golden thread: the intellectual clarity and artistic creativity that emerged when Greek settlers and Buddhist teachers began learning from each other in Gandhara over 2 millennia ago. The Greeks brought with them a love of systematic inquiry, a passion for understanding the world through reason and observation. The Buddhists offered an equally systematic exploration, but one turned inward, toward the nature of consciousness and the causes of suffering. When these two traditions met, something remarkable happened. Methods for organizing and categorizing the Dharma were refined. Psychological insights into the mind were expressed with new clarity. Artistic forms for depicting the Buddha and his teachings were born that would spread as far as Korea, Japan, and Indonesia. The river had begun to gather tributaries. Echoes in modern times. Fast forward 20 centuries. Buddhism began meeting the West again, this time not in the shadow of the Hindu Kush, but in the lecture halls of European universities, in the notebooks of poets and philosophers, in the meditation halls of San Francisco and Berlin. Once again, Western seekers found themselves drawn to what had fascinated their Greek ancestors: the systematic methods for understanding how the mind works, appealing to cultures steeped in science and rational inquiry; the practical tools for emotional balance and ethical living, speaking to people hungry for meaning beyond material success;
the universal truths about suffering and peace that transcend culture, religion, and geography. When you download a meditation app or attend a mindfulness retreat, you are, whether you realize it or not, participating in a cultural synthesis that began when Greek and Buddhist monks debated philosophy in Gandhara. The clear, step-by-step meditation instructions that guide you through mindful breathing, they reflect organizational principles that trace back to Greek love for structured inquiry. The psychological frameworks used in modern mindfulness-based therapy carry the intellectual DNA of conversations that happened in Central Asian monasteries over 2 millennia ago. Modern mindfulness programs in hospitals, schools, and corporate offices are not a rupture with the past. They are a continuation. They represent the same bridge-building impulse that once allowed Greek families in Gandhara to honor their heritage while embracing Buddhist ethics and contemplative practice. The river continues to adapt to the landscape it flows through, now addressing challenges like information overload, social media anxiety, climate grief, and the relentless pace of modern life. An ancient lesson for a fractured world. Perhaps the most hopeful lesson from this history is what it reveals about human beings at our best. In an age when cultural differences often lead to conflict, the story of Greek and Buddhist encounter shines like a beacon. It shows us what becomes possible when different traditions meet with genuine curiosity and mutual respect. Those early communities in Gandhara didn't erase their differences. They didn't have to choose between preserving their Greek heritage and embracing Buddhist insights. Instead, they built bridges strong enough to hold the weight of both worlds. Out of that creative encounter came something richer than either tradition could have achieved alone. The precedent they set echoes through history. Wisdom is not the property of any single culture. It belongs to all who seek it sincerely. The peace we cultivate through meditation today connects us to an unbroken lineage of seekers who understood that truth. Archaeology as a living voice. The story is not just in the past. Archaeologists are still finding manuscripts in the caves of Afghanistan, still excavating stupas and monasteries in Pakistan's Swat Valley, still deciphering fragile birch bark scrolls that were buried with care 2,000 years ago. Each discovery adds a new verse to the ongoing song of wisdom. Some manuscripts reveal meditation instructions almost identical to those you'll find in contemporary Buddhist centers. Others contain unique teachings that don't appear anywhere else, evidence of how rich and diverse Buddhist practice was in those early centuries. Still others are written in Greek script long after any ethnic Greeks remained in the region, a testament to how deeply that cultural synthesis became embedded in daily spiritual life. It's as if the earth itself has been waiting for us to listen, revealing these texts and artifacts at the moment humanity most needs their wisdom. These ancient communities understood how fragile wisdom can be. They rolled their teachings into scrolls, wrapped them carefully in cloth, sealed them in clay jars, and hid them away, knowing that someday someone would need them. That someone is us. The river within you. The river of wisdom that began in Gandhara flows not just through history, but through you. The questions you ask, how do I live with greater peace? How do I face suffering with courage and compassion? Are the same questions that led Greek philosophers to climb mountain paths in search of Buddhist teachers. Your struggles to integrate contemplative practice with the demands of daily life mirror the struggles of those ancient families learning to balance inherited customs with new insights. And the peace you discover, the clarity you cultivate, becomes part of the ongoing story. When you sit in meditation, you are not practicing alone. You are sitting with generations of seekers across cultures and centuries. The river carries us all. It connects a Greek artisan carving the first Buddha statues with a Japanese monk ringing a temple bell, with a Tibetan yogi meditating in a cave, with a teenager today practicing mindfulness to calm their anxiety before an exam. It connects you and me right now in this shared reflection. An invitation. As you continue your own journey of discovery, remember this. You are not just a consumer of ancient wisdom. You are its guardian and its creator. Every moment you choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over ignorance, patience over anger, you help the river flow a little further. You keep the conversation alive for future generations. The Buddhist teachings began with one man under a tree. They were carried by memory, then by manuscripts, then by ships and caravans, and eventually by airplanes and satellites. They crossed mountains and oceans, languages and empires. And now they rest in your hands, your heart, your breath. The river never ends. Perhaps the most beautiful lesson of all is this: the river has no end. As long as human beings seek freedom from suffering, as long as we ask how to live wisely and kindly, as long as we build bridges across cultures instead of walls, the river will continue flowing. It will change its course, it will pick up new streams, it will find ways around every obstacle. But it will not stop, because wisdom belongs to all of us, because compassion knows no borders, because the longing for peace is the most universal human story there is. Rest here for a moment. Feel the weight and wonder of being parts of this unbroken chain. You are both student and teacher, both recipient and protector of insights too precious to lose. The same river that began in Gandhara flows through you, and through your choices, it will flow into the lives of those yet to come. The river continues, and so do you.
Chapter 1. The Unexpected Meeting of Worlds, Greek and Persian Influence on Early Buddhist Wisdom. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world over 2,300 years ago. A world where the sound of marching armies echoed across deserts and mountain passes, where traders carried not only silk and spices, but also ideas, stories, and philosophies. Empires rose and fell like the tides of a restless ocean, and yet, in the midst of conquest and chaos, seeds of wisdom were planted, seeds that would grow into some of humanity's greatest spiritual traditions. This is the story of an unexpected meeting of worlds. When we think of Buddhism today, most people imagine monks in saffron robes walking through the temples of India, China, Thailand, or Japan. We think of it as an Eastern tradition. But history has a surprising secret. The earliest travelers toward Buddhism were not from the East, but from the West. Picture this. Greek men, far from their homeland, dressed in robes resembling those of Buddhist monks, carving their names into stone, names like Dharma-Rakshitita and Maha-Dharma-Rakshitita, preserved in inscriptions for over 23 centuries. These names were not Indian or Persian, they belonged to Greeks who embraced the Dharma. How did this happen? What strange and beautiful confluence of history brought the philosophical rigor of Greece, the mystical depth of Persia, and the compassionate wisdom of the Buddha into contact? The March of Alexander and the Web of Cultures. To understand this meeting, we must go back to the time of Alexander the Great. Around 327 BCE, Alexander's armies crossed into what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, regions then known as Gandhara and Bactria. Alexander wasn't just a conqueror. Wherever his armies went, they carried Greek culture, language, art, and philosophy. But Alexander didn't march into empty lands. Long before him, the Persian Achaemenid Empire had ruled much of Central Asia, spreading not just their political power, but also their ideas. Concepts like Zoroastrian ethics, fire temples, and a belief in the eternal struggle between good and evil. The Persians built roads that connected distant cities, enabling merchants, mystics, and philosophers to move across thousands of miles.
When Alexander's soldiers reached these lands, they didn't find strangers. They found an already thriving cross-cultural exchange. Greek rationalism met Persian mysticism, and both soon encountered something even more profound: the Buddha's teachings flourishing in the Indian subcontinent and moving northward. Buddhism steps into the West. Here's the surprising part. Buddhism was not yet a global religion. It was mostly practiced in northern India. But as Buddhist monks began traveling north and west, sharing teachings of compassion and liberation, they encountered Greek and Persian thinkers who were hungry for wisdom beyond their familiar traditions. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place. A Greek philosopher trained in the teachings of Socrates and Plato hears a Buddhist monk speak of nirvana, the cessation of suffering. A Persian Zoroastrian who believes in the cosmic battle between light and darkness hears of the Buddha's middle path, a way beyond extremes. Instead of rejecting these foreign ideas, they engaged, questioned, and learned. This is how Greek men like Dharmarakshitita and Mahadharmarakshitita came to adopt Buddhism. Archaeological evidence from the Gandhara region shows inscriptions bearing their names as donors to Buddhist monasteries. These were not casual visitors, they were patrons, practitioners, and students of the Dharma. The fusion of art and philosophy. One of the most visible results of this cultural meeting was the rise of Greco-Buddhist art. Before this period, Buddhist art avoided depicting the Buddha in human form. Instead, he was represented by symbols, the Bodhi tree, an empty throne, or a footprint. But Greek artists, with their tradition of sculpting gods and heroes, began carving the first human images of the Buddha. These statues weren't just art, they carried a philosophical message. The serene face of the Buddha, sculpted with Greek realism, the flowing robe carved like a Greek toga, this was not cultural appropriation, it was cultural collaboration. The Greeks helped give Buddhism a visual identity that later traveled across Asia. Philosophy too was enriched. Greek Stoicism, with its emphasis on self-control and inner peace, resonated with Buddhist mindfulness. Persian ideas of cosmic order found echoes in Buddhist karma and dharma. None of these were identical, but they spoke to each other, creating a tapestry of wisdom that transcended borders. Persian mysticism and the Buddha's universal message. The Persian influence is equally fascinating. Zoroastrianism emphasized ethical dualism, the choice between truth and lies, light and darkness. While Buddhism does not share the idea of an eternal cosmic battle, it does speak of ignorance and wisdom, suffering and liberation. Persian travelers and Buddhist monks exchanged stories and practices. Persian mystics already valued contemplation, moral integrity, and compassion, which harmonized with Buddhist ethics. Both traditions emphasized the need to transform the self for the good of others. This cultural synergy allowed Buddhism to adapt and flourish far beyond India. Without this westward exchange, Buddhism might have remained a regional tradition. Instead, it became a universal path, attracting seekers from all corners of the known world. A meeting that changed history. It's easy to dismiss these encounters as historical footnotes, but think about it. What does it mean that 2,300 years ago, Greek and Persian thinkers were sitting under the same trees, listening to Buddhist monks, asking questions about life, death, and meaning? It means that the search for inner peace and wisdom has always been global. It means that cultures have always borrowed, blended, and enriched each other. The legacy of this meeting still lives on. The Gandhara art style influenced Buddhist imagery across Asia. Philosophical debates between Greeks and Buddhists shaped Buddhist logic and metaphysics. And most importantly, it reminds us that wisdom knows no borders. The hidden names that speak to us today. Let us return to those mysterious names, Dharmarakshitita and Mahadharmarakshitita. These Greek patrons who embraced Buddhism left behind more than inscriptions. They left a message across time that we too can step outside our familiar worlds and learn from others. That compassion and truth are not confined to any one land or people. That the unexpected meeting of worlds can give birth to something timeless. As we continue this journey in the following chapters, we'll explore how these exchanges shaped not only art and philosophy, but also the very way we think about life and the self. But for now, pause and reflect. 2,300 years ago, under the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan, Greeks, Persians, and Buddhists sat together and dreamed of a better world. Their dream is still alive, waiting for each of us to carry it forward.
Chapter 2. The Persian Foundation, the Spiritual Soil.
Chapter 3. The Greek Arrival. Rational minds meet inner stillness. History often feels like a series of disconnected events, but when we look closely, we see threads weaving cultures together in ways we never imagined. One of the most remarkable cultural intersections occurred when Greek thought met Buddhist wisdom in the heart of Central Asia. This meeting did not happen overnight. It was the result of conquests, trade, migration, and the timeless human search for meaning. The aftermath of Alexander's conquest. When Alexander the Great embarked on his legendary campaigns in the 4th century BCE, he had no idea that his march eastward would plant seeds that would bloom long after his empire crumbled. After his death in 323 BCE, his generals divided his vast territories. One such region was Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan, and parts of northern Pakistan. This area became a melting pot where Greek settlers, soldiers, philosophers, and artisans lived alongside Persians, Indians, and Central Asian tribes. But Alexander's legacy wasn't just about military might. It was about ideas. The Greeks who stayed behind carried with them their love for inquiry, art, and philosophy. They built cities with theaters and temples, introduced their styles of sculpture and coinage, and brought with them a worldview that celebrated both reason and beauty. The Greek spirit of inquiry meets Buddhist wisdom. Greek philosophy was driven by profound questions. What makes life meaningful? What does it mean to live a virtuous life? How can reason guide us toward happiness? Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had long been exploring these themes in the Mediterranean world. Meanwhile, far to the east, Buddhist monks were asking equally profound questions. What causes human suffering? How can we overcome attachment and find liberation? What is the path to inner peace? When Greek settlers encountered Buddhism in Gandhara and Bactria, there was a surprising resonance. Both cultures sought wisdom, albeit through different methods. The Greeks emphasized logic and rational discourse. Buddhism emphasized meditation and ethical living. Yet the goal was remarkably similar: a life free of ignorance and suffering. The artistic revolution, giving the Buddha a human face. Before Greek influence, Buddhist art was largely symbolic. The Buddha was represented through signs: an empty throne symbolizing his enlightenment, footprints marking his presence, or the Bodhi tree under which he attained awakening. The Buddha's physical form was considered too sacred to depict directly. But the Greeks were masters of human representation in art. They sculpted gods and heroes with lifelike detail, capturing expressions, emotions, and gestures. When Greek artisans in Gandhara began working with Buddhist themes, they created the first human-like statues of the Buddha. Draped in flowing robes resembling Greek togas, these statues portrayed the Buddha with serene expressions, elongated ears, and symbolic hand gestures, mudras. This was not just an artistic innovation, it had a spiritual impact. For the first time, people could see the Buddha's face, relate to him as a compassionate teacher, and feel a personal connection to his presence. The fusion of Greek realism with Buddhist spirituality created one of history's greatest artistic traditions, the Gandhara school of art, which later influenced Buddhist imagery all across Asia, from China to Japan. Philosophy crosses borders. The Greek influence did not stop at statues. Ideas travel too. Ancient texts and inscriptions suggest that some Greeks not only admired Buddhism, but even converted. The most famous example is King Menander, Milenda, a Greek ruler of the Indo-Greek kingdom who reigned around the 2nd century BCE. According to Buddhist tradition, he engaged in deep dialogues with a Buddhist monk named Nagasena, recorded in a text known as the Milenda Panha, the Questions of King Menander. In this remarkable text, Menander asks profound questions about the self, the soul, morality, and the path to enlightenment. Instead of dismissing these as foreign concepts, Nagasena answers them using reason and logical analogies, a style the Greeks loved. For instance, when Menander asks if there is a permanent soul, Nagasena famously compares a person to a chariot. The chariot exists as a whole, but only because of its parts. Similarly, the self exists as a collection of changing physical and mental elements, not as an eternal, unchanging entity. What's fascinating is how Greek-styled questioning and Buddhist reasoning met on common ground. This dialogue is one of the earliest recorded instances of cross-cultural philosophical exchange between East and West. Why this encounter matters for inner peace? Now, you might ask, why does this ancient history matter today? Because it teaches us a timeless lesson: wisdom grows when cultures connect. The Greeks valued rational inquiry, the Buddhists valued inner stillness. Together, they demonstrated that both reason and meditation are essential for a balanced life. Modern science tells us the same thing: a healthy mind is both analytical and mindful. When we combine rational understanding with meditative awareness, we can navigate life's challenges more skillfully. The meeting of Greek and Buddhist thought over 2,000 years ago planted the seeds for this integration. Beyond Bactria, the spread of ideas. The legacy of this Greek-Buddhist encounter extended far beyond Central Asia. The Gandhara art style traveled with Buddhist missionaries along the Silk Road into China, influencing early Buddhist cave paintings in Dunhuang and sculptures in Xi'an. The rational dialogical style of Buddhist debate found in texts like Milinda Panha shaped the way Buddhism interacted with new cultures. When Buddhism reached Greece and Rome centuries later, it was not an alien philosophy. There were already shared elements: ethics, compassion, logic, and the search for truth. This made it easier for Buddhist wisdom to resonate with Western thinkers in later centuries. Inner stillness meets the rational mind, a modern reflection. Let's pause and reflect on the symbolic meaning of this meeting between Greek settlers and Buddhist monks. On one side, the Greeks represent the outer exploration of the world, conquering lands, asking questions, seeking truth through debate and observation. On the other side, Buddhism represents the inner exploration, looking within, understanding the mind, and transcending suffering. When these two streams met, they didn't clash, they complemented each other. This is a lesson for us today. We live in a world full of noise, opinions, and divisions. To find inner peace, we must balance our outer intelligence with inner wisdom. Rational inquiry can help us ask the right questions. Meditation can help us find the right answers within. Just like the Greeks and the Buddhists over 2,000 years ago, we too can build bridges between thinking and being. Conclusion: the timeless fusion. The meeting of Greek rational minds with Buddhist inner stillness is one of the most beautiful chapters in human history. It shows that wisdom knows no borders. Cultures may differ in language and art, but the human quest for peace and meaning is universal. Greek philosophers asked, "How should we live?" Buddhist monks asked, "How should we let go?" Together, they offered humanity a deeper answer: live with reason, act with compassion, and rest in inner peace. This ancient fusion reminds us that even today, when East and West meet with openness and respect, something transformative can happen, not just in history books, but in our own hearts.
Chapter 4: Dharma Rakshitita and Mahadharma Rakshitita, the Greek monks. When we think of Buddhism, we often imagine saffron-robed monks in India, Sri Lanka, or Thailand. We picture serene faces, meditation under Bodhi trees, and ancient stupas. Rarely do we imagine men of Greek heritage, raised with the myths of Zeus, the logic of Aristotle, and the heroism of Homer, dedicating their lives to the Buddha's Dharma. And yet, history gives us a fascinating surprise. Among the earliest Buddhist monks outside India were men with Greek names carved into stone inscriptions for eternity. The world after Alexander the Great. To understand their journey, we must first travel back to the time after Alexander the Great. His conquest swept across Greece, Persia, and into northwestern India. After his death, Greek settlers remained in regions like Bactria, modern Afghanistan, and Gandhara, parts of modern Pakistan. These were bustling crossroads of trade and culture, where merchants, philosophers, and travelers mingled. Silk from China, spices from India, and ideas from everywhere met along these ancient roads. The Greeks brought with them Hellenistic culture, art that celebrated the human form, philosophy that valued reason and inquiry, and a curiosity about the world that was unmatched. In this melting pot of cultures, something extraordinary happened. Greek thought and Buddhist wisdom began to meet. The discovery of Greek Buddhist monks. Centuries later, archaeologists made a stunning discovery. Inscriptions found in Afghanistan recorded the names of Greek men who had become Buddhist monks. Among them were two figures whose names shine in history, Dharmarakshitita and Mahadharmarakshitita. The names themselves are revealing. Dharmarakshitita roughly means one who is protected by the Dharma, while Mahadharmarakshitita means the Great One who is protected by the Dharma. These were not mere admirers or casual followers. They were bhikshus, fully ordained monks who lived and breathed the teachings of the Buddha. But pause for a moment and picture the scene. These were men likely born to Greek families. They would have grown up hearing tales of Achilles and Odysseus, learning the dialogues of Plato, and participating in civic discussions on ethics and virtue. Their ancestors revered Apollo and Athena. And yet, here they were, far from the Mediterranean, sitting cross-legged in Gandhara, chanting Pali Suttas, meditating on impermanence, and walking barefoot with begging bowls. What brought them here? Why did Greeks become Buddhists? To answer this, we need to look at what Greek and Buddhist philosophy shared and what they lacked. Greek philosophy had long asked, what is the good life? How should one live? What is the ultimate reality? Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle explored ethics, metaphysics, and virtue. They debated, questioned, and reasoned. But for all its brilliance, Greek thought largely remained intellectual. It was philosophy of the mind, not necessarily of direct inner experience. Buddhism offered something new, a path of practice. It didn't just ask questions, it provided meditation as an answer. The Buddha taught that suffering, dukkha, was universal, but liberation was possible through ethical living, meditation, and wisdom. This was not abstract theory, it was a step-by-step guide to inner freedom. For a Greek seeker disillusioned with the endless debates of philosophers, Buddhism must have been revolutionary. Here was a path where you didn't just talk about virtue, you trained your mind. You didn't just speculate about the afterlife, you explored your consciousness directly through meditation. It was philosophy brought to life. Life of Dharmarakshitita and Mahadharmarakshitita. We know little about the daily lives of these Greek monks, but we can imagine based on Buddhist traditions and historical context. At dawn, they likely rose to meditate. They would sit quietly, observing their breath, calming their minds. Later, they would walk barefoot into nearby villages with bowls in hand, receiving offerings of food from local laity. In return, they would share short teachings on compassion, mindfulness, and the Dharma. They would study Buddhist scriptures, reciting the Pali Canon under the guidance of elder monks. Perhaps they even helped translate Buddhist ideas into Greek, contributing to the spread of Buddhism beyond India. After all, Gandhara would later become famous for its Greco-Buddhist art, where the Buddha was depicted in a style inspired by Greek sculpture, robes draped like a toga, faces serene like Apollo. But more than their outer activities, it is their inner journey that fascinates us. Imagine what it felt like to leave behind the world of Greek gods and philosophers and embrace the Eightfold Path. Imagine the courage it took to adopt a life of simplicity, renouncing wealth and status, seeking only truth. Cultural exchange, the seeds of global Buddhism. The presence of Greek monks shows us that Buddhism was never meant to be confined to one culture. It was universal from the very beginning. Just as the Dharma spread to Sri Lanka, China, and Japan in later centuries, it first spread westward through men like Dharmarakshitita and Mahadharmarakshitita. Their existence also hints at a deep cultural exchange. Greek rationalism may have influenced Buddhist philosophy, leading to the rich schools of logic and debate in later Mahayana Buddhism. Conversely, Buddhist compassion and meditative practice may have inspired Greeks seeking something beyond reason, a direct path to peace. Lessons for us today. Why does this story matter today? Because it reminds us that wisdom knows no boundaries. In our modern world, where cultures often clash and people focus on differences, the story of Dharmarakshitita and Mahadharmarakshitita teaches us that truth can unite us. These Greek monks didn't see Buddhism as foreign. They saw it as a path to peace, relevant to their lives. Similarly, the Dharma's teachings are not just for one religion or nationality. They are for anyone who suffers and seeks freedom. Their story also reminds us that inner peace is not just about ideas, it is about practice. The Greeks had brilliant philosophies, but they still sought meditation. Today, we too are flooded with information, books, podcasts, debates. But peace comes only when we sit quietly, breathe, and look within. A vision of unity. Picture this. Under the vast Afghan sky, in an early Buddhist monastery, monks gather for evening chanting. Some have dark Indian features, others have the lighter features of Greeks. They speak different mother tongues, but their voices unite in Pali verses. Sabbe sankhara anicca. All conditioned things are impermanent. In that moment, there is no East or West, Greek or Indian. There are only seekers of truth. Centuries later, their names carved on stones still speak to us. Dharmarakshitita, Mahadharmarakshitita. Greek men who became Buddhist monks, bridging worlds, cultures, and minds. Their lives whisper across time. Peace is possible. Wisdom is universal. And the Dharma belongs to all. Conclusion of Chapter 4. The story of Dharmarakshitita and Mahadharmarakshitita is not just a historical curiosity. It is a symbol of the human quest for meaning. It shows that inner transformation transcends cultural boundaries. It shows that the Dharma has always been global, long before modern globalization. As we move forward in our exploration of Greek and Persian influences on Buddhism, let us remember these monks, proof that even in the ancient world, seekers from different lands could sit together in stillness, sharing the same path to awakening.
Conclusion. When we look back at history, it's easy to imagine Buddhism as an isolated Eastern tradition, but the truth is far richer. The story of early Buddhist wisdom is also the story of human connection across continents. Greek thinkers who once pondered the nature of virtue and the soul, Persian kings who allowed spiritual diversity to flourish, and Indian monks who carried the Dharma along the Silk Road, all contributed to shaping a path that speaks to the heart even today. This cultural exchange reminds us that wisdom is never limited by geography or language. The flowing robes of the Gandhara Buddha, the echoes of Stoic calm and Buddhist meditation, and the openness of the Persian empires all reflect one shared human longing: inner peace amid life's chaos. The fusion of these traditions gave birth to a universal message that peace does not depend on where we are born, what gods we worship, or which philosophies we study. Instead, it arises from our own disciplined mind and compassionate heart. In today's world of division and noise, this lesson feels more relevant than ever. The early Greek and Persian influences on Buddhism show us that when cultures meet with respect and curiosity, wisdom expands and humanity moves closer to harmony. Buddhism's journey westward was more than the spread of a religion. It was the weaving together of ideas from East and West to create a deeper understanding of life. And in that weaving lies the timeless truth. Inner peace belongs to all of us, across every culture, every era, and every border.